Welcome back to Tide Pod, presented by Tide Illustrated. Got all the Bama coverage you could ask for. Jack Dalton, Tony Sakalis. We've got a ton to dive into. Transfer portal happenings for both Bama football and basketball. We're going to start with football, Tony, do a little recap, dive into some of the players Alabama added and some of the holes that still are lingering at the moment for Coach Kalen DeBoer and company, particularly in the secondary. But Tony, let's talk about the big three additions from the transfer portal here this spring for Alabama. Starting, of course, with the return, the familiar face on the offensive line, Caden Proctor. The Tide also made an addition at kicker and Graham Nicholson. And most recently, in the last few days here, Cameron Howard, the DB from Charlotte. Three pretty solid additions, but I think we should start with Proctor. We'll go in chronological order for those three. What were your thoughts? We've talked about the saga here before, but he is back in the fold. It's a huge addition here for the Tide's offensive line.
Look, first off, this whole, perceived notion of this being this epic transfer portal window where there was just so many big time names that just never materialized. I mean, really, Caden Proctor was one of the biggest names that entered. So if you look at, if you look at it from, Alabama already had him, so it's not that exciting because they just got a player back. Sure, yeah, it's not as exciting, but if you could look at it, I guess, from a optimistic view of Alabama landed perhaps definitely one of the best available players in the spring window, and there wasn't a lot of great tackles either. I think really Caden Proctor was the only super elite tackle. So for a team that needed to add at the tackle position, they got the best one, even though it was the guy that they already had. So. I think it's a extremely important piece. He's supposedly lost some weight, a good amount. Unofficially, I've heard he's lost up to around 25 pounds, and that was his problem where he was a little slow last year. If he plays at a different weight, he's going to have to with this new offense. But if he can kind of improve on some of that, conditioning work and some of the problems that ailed him when he was struggling last year, I think he's got all the talent in the world. So that's a great piece. It's even more of an important piece now that, kind of some offseason, news as well. Elijah Pritchett was arrested for the second time this offseason, for reckless speeding. And what is Alabama going to do with him? You've got Miles McVay and Wilkin Formby at the right tackle position. It might end up being, depending on what happens with Elijah Pritchett, it could be Caden Proctor and one of those two. Let's see what the approach that Kalen DeBoer makes, but it's a big deal that he got a tackle now, especially because now one of his current ones might be in limbo. So that's a huge addition in multiple ways, in terms of depth, in terms of just the potential that Proctor, has. Can't say enough about that one. So, that's the biggest move. Yeah, we can move on to the next one, which I think you're going to talk about, Graham Nicholson, the Lou Groza.
Well, yeah, the Lou Groza Award winner, the one who robbed Will Reichard in many of Alabama fans' eyes, at least. Will Reichard did get his vindication by getting drafted and making it so that Nick Saban had every position taken under his tenure, which was my favorite stat that came out of the 2024 draft. But yeah, you've gone in, you've had this narrative for a while under Saban that he doesn't seem to have super great kickers. Reichard comes in and cancels all that out. Then he leaves and Saban leaves. You're wondering, where they're going to get, where they're going to replace the seemingly irreplaceable with Will Reichard. They get in, the best kicker in the country by the Lou Groza Award standards in Graham Nicholson. Brought him in. I think he made, I want to say it was 45 out of his 47 kick attempts last season. I know we're not, there's not too much to dive into with analyzing kickers. I could talk about kickers all day, but pretty big addition here with the foot of Graham Nicholson.
I want to pull up the stats on Graham Nicholson because it's actually interesting. I think he actually missed 2 extra points and only 1 field goal.
He did. Yeah.
Place kicking, we're going to look at it. He's 27 of 28 on field goal attempts and 35 of 37 on extra point attempts. So, but those are great numbers. He's an extremely consistent kicker. Now, did he have the pressure kicks? Some of the ones, I think that's the thing that Alabama fans were saying that Reichard should have won, because really Reichard should have won when he was went the whole season in the COVID year without missing. I think that's uh, I think it might have been, give him the
His
benefit
best
of the
shot.
doubt. Jokingly though, I mean, Alabama finally gets a kicker that can win the Lou Groza Award, but um, no, I think that's a huge addition. And you looked at it at A-Day, we didn't get to see the spring scrimmages. Actually, I got pretty good reports from the kickers at the scrimmages, but during A-Day, I thought kicking didn't look all that great. You had Connor Talty, who was on scholarship, but um, he was competing with walk-on Upton Belafonte. It just kind of seemed like, if your scholarship kicker is competing with your walk-on, it's never like a super great sign. And then just have the opportunity to grab the Lou Groza Award winner, you always take that. I think there's plenty of teams across the nation that would have taken Graham Nicholson. So the fact that Alabama had an opening, that's extremely huge. And it's like, what a luxury you have to replace Will Reichert with the best kicker in the nation, or at least according to that award. I feel dirty saying the best kicker in the nation, because I feel like Alabama fans are just going to come out the walls and like defend Will Reichert's honor. But I think you're basically getting the production that you're losing in Will Reichert, whether or not
Yeah.
you want to argue if he's better or not. I mean, like 27 of 28 is pretty dang good. So 2 for 2 so far in terms of the getting a guy that I think is going to make a big impact on the transfer portal. And then so
Yeah.
um, how much impact does a kicker make? Well, sometimes you'd say not a lot. I think from an Alabama perspective, they'd tell you that it definitely can make a lot of impact.
Yeah, I think you either want your name in the headlines in the way Will Reichert had his as the kicker, or you don't want to be talked about at all. If you're not getting spoken about as a kicker, you're doing your job and you're not the problem. And I think that's as much as Alabama fans can ask for in a guy replacing Will Reichert. And I think it's a nice way to pass the torch from a guy who will go down in Crimson Tide history. So yeah, good addition with Graham Nicholson. And then we get to the storyline kind of this transfer portal window for Alabama, Tony. In Cameron Howard, I think let's talk about him first before we dive into the larger scale of the DB room and what that's going to kind of look like next season. Cameron Howard, a guy coming in from Charlotte, I believe, had 38 tackles, pair of interceptions as a true freshman in Charlotte. Came out of St. Francis High School, which of course produced a couple of Crimson Tide players, notably Chris Braswell and Darian Dalcourt, who got their names, or Braswell got his name called. Dalcourt as a UDFA in the NFL. So a little pipeline from St. Francis over in Maryland to Alabama. But Cameron Howard, the DB, what should Tide fans expect from him in his sophomore year, his first year with Alabama?
I'll let you expand on this, because I know you talked with his former head coach. But I think when you look at Cameron Howard, from what I've heard, he's kind of brought on to be a depth piece. I don't think he's going to be a starter. They didn't bring him in to like. I think they were looking to add some depth at the safety position heading in to the transfer portal. So they got that. I don't think I mean, you've got Malachi Moore and Keon Sabb at the two safety spots. You've got either Devontae Smith or Red Morgan, who had the true freshman, who had a really good spring at that Husky position. So I think the safety quote unquote spots are all kind of taken. But as a second team player, to have somebody that has some starting experience at Charlotte, I think that when you look at this secondary, it not only lacks experience, at the cornerback position, and we'll get to that, but it not only lacks experience at the starting defense, it lacks it, in the backups as well. So like, yes, you had starting experience in Malachi Moore and Keon Sabb, but after that, there wasn't a lot of experience. And so to have a guy that you can come in and kind of have a reserve role, he's only a sophomore, so he'll grow. I mean, you're going to lose Keon Sabb and Malachi Moore next spring, so he might be in contention for a starting job, next season. And being able to kind of develop a guy like that, I think, could be a really big deal. You talked with his coach. Maybe what did you hear about kind of the player that Alabama's getting?
Yeah, I mean, the two takeaways from his coach at St. Francis when I talked to him are, uh, you mentioned needing that depth and having a little bit more experience there. That seems like what he's going to bring. He actually transferred into St. Francis at the high school level from another school in Maryland, came in before his senior season, and his coach was kind of talking about he basically came in and was a leader right away. So it seems like you're getting a guy with a good head on his shoulders, someone who's going to come in, learn the program, and want to teach it to others, I guess, or have a kind of a leadership responsibility no matter how much playing time he's expecting to get or not. And then on the field, it sounds like he's kind of a dog. I think his coach said to me at high school, he had to kind of stop Howard from wanting to like run through everything he saw. Essentially, he is a hard hitting corner, seems to kind of relish that part of the game. So I think it's exactly what you want to hear if you're, an Alabama fan, a guy who, yeah, whether or not he's on the field a whole bunch is not going to, be a headache. In fact, quite the opposite. It seems like he's going to help his team, and help that room kind of grow and become better. And then on the field, he's going to hit some people. So, what more can you really ask for? But yeah, I think it's a quality addition from that standpoint. But like you said, I mean, it doesn't solve the overall problem of this DB room that it seems like heading into next season. I mean, you talk about Red Morgan, you're expecting a lot of it as a true freshman at safety, as good as he has looked. And, you saw with Caleb Downs what he was able to do. That was a really special player. Whether Red Morgan is like that in his first year remains to be seen. Obviously, you hope so if you're a Bama fan, but that there's some real lack of experience and notable, or I guess proven talent at the SEC level. They added some good 5 stars in Jalen Mbakwe, Zabian Brown. Zay Mincy's a good player, but what is this cornerback room in particular, Tony, going to look like next season with seemingly not enough time left to add a guy in the transfer portal? You could mention Ed Woods, the Arizona State guy, missing out as well, coming to
Yeah,
Bama.
yeah, and it's up for debate on how what they viewed Ed Woods, and if he was going to be, if they viewed him as a definite starter, or if like how interested Alabama was, but ultimately he chose Michigan State. I think at the moment, you look at this room and you got a true freshman starting at cornerback, and you got Zabian Brown there, really talented kid, mature for his age, like both on and off the field, but a guy that you look at 8A. I mean, just I'm not trying to down him because I think he had an amazing spring, but look at some of the plays on 8A, some of the big plays that Jeremy Bernard made. He beat Zabian Brown, like, and that's going to happen when you start playing, your Tennessees, your Georgias. I mean, teams with offenses that are going to have really like NFL players. You're going to just expect a little bit of a growing pain from having a true freshman. So it would have been nice to get an experienced kind of starter. Right now, the only cornerback on Alabama's roster with even a snap of college experience is Damani Jackson, the Southern California transfer. And even he, I mean, like, he's a 5-star kid, a really talented guy. And I think he's gotten a lot of rave reviews, but he didn't have the best season at USC last year. So, you can only count on him too much, like so much. And like, he might have some growing pains as well. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, he's not just this like surefire. You're not getting like Kool-Aid McKinstry right now. You know what I'm saying? Like, could he become Kool-Aid? Does he have Kool-Aid talent? Yes, but he's got to kind of like have that breakout season himself. So it's kind of like, there's a lot of uncertainty at that cornerback position. By the time you're hearing this, the transfer portal will be closed. That doesn't mean that Alabama can't add another cornerback. So yeah, you can go and look. There's a few cornerbacks in there that Alabama could grab. There hasn't really been a name that's like super at least at the time of recording this, there's not like one that's like stands out as somebody
Flashy.
that Alabama is definitely like linked to right now. But I would expect them to make a move at the cornerback position. I think, at the time of recording this just after, and we'll get to this too, but Tony Mitchell entering the portal. I think Alabama, by my count, is down to 83. Now, there's different ways to count it. Some people have the number at different numbers, but we at Tide Illustrated are counting it at 83. So there's probably room to add a couple more. And like I said, sometimes that number gets kind of, Alabama has ways of making that number work. So I would say that there's room to add multiple players now through the portal, and um, we'll see. I mean, we're recording this right now. We'll see if any other Alabama players leave, but um, I think when you're looking at it, like I would expect some additions, even if it's just a depth piece or something kind of similar to Cameron Howard. Like I think you got to add to that position. There's only 5 cornerbacks on the roster. Just from a pure numbers perspective, like you need to add another cornerback. Like I don't care who it is.
Mhm.
So I expect them to do that. But yeah, you talked about I guess I mentioned Tony Mitchell. He went in the portal, and so did Peyton Woodyard. So it's not just the Alabama, it's not just the additions, I guess. You have those two, and then another big one. We kind of skipped over when we were talking about the offensive line, but James Brockermeyer is now going to TCU. So I guess starting with the safeties. I think you're not necessarily. I mean, Peyton Woodyard was a Rivals 100 kid, and that loss stings. But from a next year standpoint, I don't think he might have been in that backup rotation. I think the addition of like Cameron Howard was not brought in to replace Peyton Woodyard. I think they would have preferred to have both,
Mhm.
but he might end up kind of being a Peyton Woodyard replacement. He's still young. He's still a sophomore. He's gonna kind of be in that same role. He can play. One thing we didn't mention about him is he can play both the slot and the deep safety. So he's versatile. You can plug him in a lot of places. I think Peyton Woodyard's a guy that you could have done a lot of that with. So you lose him. Tony Mitchell. I mean, he was kind of. He's been a story. I think most people have been projecting him to transfer. I know another service said that he was going to transfer, and he disputed it, and then now he's going and indeed transferring. So I think it's been kind of a rumor that he was going to be gone. Anyways, he wasn't in too deep during the spring when we were able to watch. Just doesn't seem like he's a factor for Alabama's defense. So it's not necessarily surprising. I don't think you're losing that much there. Um, James Brockermeyer, that is interesting as well. You look at that center position, you have James Brockermeyer, who was the first team center all of spring camp. And now, you had Parker Brailsford, the Washington transfer, just MIA for a non-football related issue. Now, Kalen DeBoer has multiple times said that like it's not a big deal or it's not anything that's like going to jeopardize his future with the team, that he's here to stay. He's not in any trouble. But still, he didn't get to go through spring camp with the offensive line. He didn't get to gel. I mean, maybe a little bit, but he didn't, he missed the majority of spring camp. And so you've got him and Joseph Ionetta, a true freshman. It's kind of scary. I don't know what they're going to do at the center position. Do you move a position? Do you, Kaplovich, the new offensive line coach, said that he was going to have multiple people work on snapping. Well, he's going to have to because he has no depth there anymore. So, uh, that's an interesting spot. I think the other position that Alabama lost was Curtis Perry on the defensive line. Not a big. I don't think that's a guy he was a highly rated recruit or a 4-star recruit, but he's not going to factor in the defense. He wasn't, up on the depth chart. So I don't think that, we won't spend much time on that. Ultimately, when you look at Alabama's transfer portal, I don't know how you would grade it. I think I'd give it a B. Um,
Yeah. B or B minus.
I think it's still. I mean, obviously, there's time to add. We'll see who they get, but um, you filled a definite need at the offensive line with Proctor. The kicker is just kind of like a nice thing to have. I mean, you should get credit for that. But missing out on an experienced cornerback, at least to now, I expect them to add. Um, that's kind of alarming to me. I don't know what you think about it, but for me, that's raises a lot of question marks.
Yeah, I think overall I agree. That was going to be my last question, was just how would you look at this overall from a departure standpoint? But I think you addressed, all of them, and they're not significant, solo, with maybe the exception of Brock or Meyer. But when you take two cornerbacks out, like you said, it goes down to a numbers game. And you're putting a lot on, yes, highly touted true freshmen, but true freshmen nonetheless competing in the SEC and competing for a team that wants to win a championship. I mean, everyone's heard it before. That's thin ice to skate on. When you're heading into a season as a first year head coach, a first year defensive coordinator, trying to compete and keep a team at the top. So, I think it's certainly going to be interesting to see where Alabama puts their attention towards in the portal, what guys they maybe go after, and whether or not those guys are going to have the quality to try and keep this DB room at an elite level. You have a limited pool. Yeah, you can only pick from who you got in the portal. Not saying that addition is guaranteed to fail or whatever, but you never know who you're going to get either way in the portal, and it might be a situation where the talent just isn't there, and that remains to be seen what Coach Womack can do with those guys.
One
Do
thing
you
I
have
want to
any?
Yeah, I was
Yeah.
gonna say one thing I want to point out too. We didn't mention it was Khalil Jacobs, the inside linebacker from South Alabama. He's gonna visit this weekend, and I think Alabama's obviously got a great chance with him. Ken Womack is the former South Alabama head coach. I mean, without saying too much, I kind of think there's a reason why you go into the portal. Alabama, was going to be interested in him earlier. Yes, that's a big target. He's going to add just depth to the inside linebacking room. I don't think he's going to necessarily start over Deontay Lawson or Jahad Campbell, but he's a guy that knows Kane Womack's defense, which is going to help, especially at that linebacker position if he does get it on the field. And then just like to get some experience depth behind those two, I think will be big. Alabama's losing Tresman Marshall, which doesn't seem like a big deal, but it was nice to have Tresman Marshall last year when you had both Lawson and Campbell deal with injuries, and you could kind of have an experienced guy to slot in there. I think Jacobs can be that guy. I think he had a couple of starts for South Alabama last year. He had 3 sacks, and he's a guy that can operate really well in Kane Womack's defense. So keep an eye out for him. He's going to visit on the weekend. I would think Alabama's got a good shot. Nothing's final until it's final, but he's a person I would expect them to add.
Yeah, that's a good guy to point out. It's going to be an interesting portal season from observing who Alabama might target in addition to him. But yeah, I think I would agree with you. It seems pretty likely he's gonna come in and take some depth role. I think that's a good segue when you mentioned nothing being final till it's final. To look at Alabama basketball, and we're talking transfer portal, and that has been the talk of the town since minute one after this team's historic run to the Final Four was what were they going to do, who is going to leave, who is going to come in. The dust has almost settled apart from a big literally and positionally standpoint for Alabama. Let's talk about the good before we get into speculating, Tony. Something we do know. It's entering the portal season. It's entering the draft season. We know now Mark Sears and Jaron Stevenson are both going to declare for the draft, but maintain their college eligibility. That's interesting to watch there. But a guy who maybe we thought was going to declare for the draft and probably stay in and just turn pro is coming back in Grant Nelson, which is, safe to say a pretty massive pull for Alabama to have him back in the front court for next season. You look at what he did in the tournament. What are your thoughts on that in terms of you look at the rest of what Alabama's been able to do, guys who they lost, how they've replaced, to now have Nelson back in the fold with the potential of maybe getting Mark Sears back as well. Jaron Stevenson, a guy I think will ultimately come back for his second season, though he's entering the draft. It's looking pretty good right now. Before we get into the more speculative stuff, thoughts on Grant Nelson here coming back for another year?
I mean, yeah, like if you would have asked, it's been a while since we've done one of these podcasts, but I guarantee you the last time we did one, if you would have asked me if Grant Nelson was going to come back, I would have said absolutely not. So the fact that they were able to convince him to come back is that's huge. I mean, he is a guy I think is only going to get better in his second year in playing Power 5 basketball as well. And, you saw what he did in the tournament. And we'll get to this later, but I think if you can get him a big and play him at the 4, where he's not having to play the 5 all the time, and Alabama can get some support down low, I think he can be even better But yeah, Grant Nelson's a guy that I just think totally fits the system, can totally, play, and I expect him to get even better. So getting him back for another year is huge and an unexpected boost. And I think it's one of the things that's really going to make this Alabama roster the best roster that's had. We'll kind
Right.
of go through every one of those spots, but in terms of Grant Nelson, I think just what an unexpected boost that Alabama is going to get. I think it's going to benefit both of them too. I think it's real tempting for some of these kids to go out to the and test the professional waters, or you see that money, but it sounds like Alabama got Grant a nice NIL package, and he's going to be staying. And so I think obviously Alabama will benefit. I think Grant Nelson's game will benefit from another year in Nate Oates' system. So I think it's a win-win. As Michael Scott would say, a win-win-win. Uh, so, so
I think you have to assume at this rate that any stars you're bringing in, whether they're new or returnees, that's going to be nice NIL packages, no matter who that is. But yeah, I mean, let's talk about the rest of this roster again. Before we dive into the big man stuff, you know, y- you have the question mark still somewhat looming over Mark Sears and coming back, but what Nate Oates has put together for next season, I mean, is just a phenomenal haul. You've got some good assortment of transfer guards in Houston Mallett, Chris Youngblood, Aiden Holloway from Auburn, sweet get there, and then Oates' best recruiting class ever. I believe it's the number 3 class we have ranked just below Duke and Rutgers for some reason, because Rutgers just decided to recruit a whole bunch of 5 stars. But you have a top 3 recruiting class: Darion Reed, Aiden Sherrill, Nas Cunningham, the known names, and then Liberian Philon, who has been linked to Alabama for some time, also a former Auburn commit. So if you're keeping count, that is 2 Auburn committed players who are now on Alabama. I know fans have been keeping count, but especially with those guards, Tony, I mean, this is just a loaded roster one way or another before or while you await what Mark Sears decides to do in this big man situation.
yeah, and I think part of this too is last year Nate Oates was just totally burned by Charles Bediako, at the last minute deciding to leave and him not really having an extra center to put in. I think the expectation is that Mark Sears will come back. And unless he hears something from an NBA team that changes his mind, I think there's a lot of optimism that Mark Sears will come back. If he doesn't, Nate Oates has positioned himself to withstand that blow. Obviously, Alabama is going to be a much better team with Mark Sears, but to have LeBaron, sorry, I couldn't get out of my mouth, LeBaron Philon and Aiden Holloway as your point guard options, that's not a bad thing to turn to. I mean, you got a McDonald's All-American, albeit one that struggled at Auburn last year, but somebody that, in Aiden Holloway, and I think he can benefit in Nate Oates' system. And then LeBaron is a guy that has wanted to be a part of. There's been interest in Alabama from his camp for a while now, and he got released from his NLI at Kansas, and he's a top 30 kid as well. So yeah, you've got 2 really good point guards that while they'll be young and they won't be Mark Sears, they're totally capable and can do a lot of things in this offense. But that's even if you don't have Mark Sears return. But the likelihood is that Mark Sears does return, and then you've got both of those guys coming off the bench. I mean, it's kind of incredible that Aiden Holloway, a former McDonald's All-American, could be a third string point guard on a team. But that just shows you how good Alabama's roster could be next year. So they really stacked it up with that point guard position. I think with between Mallett and Chris Youngblood, those are 2 guys that can shoot the heck out of the ball. You also return Latrell Wrightsell, so you've got a lot of guards. I think with all these guards, Jack, and we'll get to the bigs later, because we'll talk about Alabama needs to add, and it's probably going to add that rim protector. I wouldn't be surprised if they go like 4 guard a lot. Maybe not as a starting lineup, but there'll be probably rotations where you'll have just 4 small guards, especially if you can get that rim protector and just go 4 small and a rim protector, and just like play really small ball. There's different options now, but I think last year proved that you can't have too many guards. I think we were talking about this, before heading into this podcast, and so I expect to get creative with it. There'll be people that get looks. I think there'll be from a depth standpoint this year. Alabama struggled when they lost Latrell Wrightsell last year. If you're in a situation where, let's say, they lose Wrightsell or lose somebody else, there's going to be more really, really capable players, star almost players, being able to step in and fill that role. So you won't see as much of a drop off as you did last year.
Yeah, I think to just add to that point, I mean, I don't think the four guard lineup is unreasonable to say at all. I think Oates realized that's something he can strategize with last year. And I think it's something he really fell in love with. Not to mention, he did that last year, having Grant Nelson operate as a traditional five man, which he is not. He is a power forward. He's a swing kind of big who can play in and outside. So, I think that becomes way more scary if you're an opponent where if you add a traditional rim protector in a four guard lineup, Oates is way more comfortable doing that, got comfortable doing it without a traditional big. So, not to get too in the weeds with all that, but I think you're right. And I think, with Reitzel being injured, Oates realized last season that, he didn't have enough guards. He had to put a lot of strain on Mark Sears and Aaron Estrada's legs. I think that contributed to their sort of skid at the end of the season. I think those two were really tired with Reitzel not being available. And I think he's not messing around with that this year, one way or another. And he's got that covered for sure, whether you're going to get Mark Sears back or not, which again, everybody who does not wear crimson probably doesn't want that, because that is not just top five or best player in the SEC returning, that's a top five player in the country coming back. So, it remains to be seen on that. But let's finish with this, Tony. The news that everyone wants to know. No, we are not sure if Alabama is going to get Clifford Omeroy or Ugonna Onyenso. We've seen the Patrick Murphy Clifford pictures on Twitter like you all have. But that is the question of the day. That is the seemingly cherry on top of this potential top five, top three, whatever you want to call it, roster is the traditional blocker, the Charles Bediako that was missing last year. Those are the two, very publicized options. Is Cliff Omeroy from Rutgers, averaged about 10 and 8 and 2 blocks a game. And then, recently you've had this guy, Ugonna Onyenso, come in, who was just a sophomore at Kentucky last season, kept his name out of the NBA draft. So he's not even going through that process. You have to worry. That's an interesting point. Left Kentucky after Calipari went to Arkansas. Also averaged about 2 point something blocks last season. These are two pretty good options, Tony, here at the center position. That Clifford Omeroy was just on campus. Onyenso, I don't believe is visited, but there's the natural links there. What do you make of all of it with all the smoke around both of them? And I think, to me, however it shakes out, you're getting a pretty great addition to this great roster.
I think they both can do what you need them to do. I think probably if you look at it, the like Ugana's like his depth, or not his potential, his like ceiling is higher. I think maybe with what he can do. I think with Cliff, it's he's more established. I think he's also more of a scorer. But I think from a raw talent, I think you might have more talent the other way. I think maybe you could argue it both ways, but I'm kind of more on the camp of I think Cliff Omeroy would be the total, if you just want to build the dream roster. I did that in a column recently. I think he's the guy. I think because also he brings a little bit of an offensive game, and whenever you have a defensive only player, which Onyenso is kind of at the moment kind of more just a rim protector defensive guy. I think with Omeroy, you have that that ability to kind of add. You don't want to limit yourself on offense and give the other team a break. So I think either way they're fine. And I think Alabama, I don't necessarily, there's other options beyond that. And I think Alabama is very confident that they're going to get a rim protector. I personally don't see it getting beyond those two. I think, Alabama will make sure that it lands one of those two. I think Onyenso not going to the pros or like not going into the NBA draft really kind of helped that a lot too. So that's one less thing Alabama has to worry about, right? I don't think anybody really knows what for certain what's going to happen with Cliff Omeroy. He's going to visit North Carolina on Thursday. He's probably going to make his decision this weekend, and so we'll just see. I mean, if he comes back and Mark Sears comes back, or if they land Omeroy and Mark Sears comes back, I think it's the best roster in the nation. And it'll definitely be the best roster Alabama's had, and it's a roster that you don't just say, oh, this team could make a run to the Final Four. This team could be like, this team should win. Like you should have the same expectations you have with prime Nick Saban Alabama football, like over the past few years. You should have the same expectations with this roster if that's what the roster is. I mean, if you can add that rim protector and get Mark Sears back, I mean, you're going a legit 13 deep. I mean, just an absolute 13 players who could probably start on at least a mid-tier SEC team, which is just absolutely nuts.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you think about, like, we haven't even talked about Darion Reed, the 5-star freshman who could, by all accounts, maybe start this season because of what he brings and the potential NBA talent that he is. I mean, the worst player on this team, if you're projecting it to what you said, is potentially Mohamed Diabate, who, if you cast your minds back, won almost single-handedly won Alabama a tournament game, in March. And that's no disrespect to his game. That's just with how talented this team is next year, and is going to be, if all of that pans out. I mean, I think it's been a marvelous off season. I think, yeah, exactly. You run 13 deep. Like, you don't play that many guys in college basketball. Bruce Pearl in Auburn did that last season for much of the regular season. It was a widely talked about thing because it was like, are you going to trim this rotation? How are you going to trim this rotation? And so like, to have all of those reserves, I think it covers you for injuries. It covers you for all those things. But
I would say
it's an exciting time.
the only hole in this potential lineup. We'll just call him rim protectors, whether it's between those two. Let's just call that addition rim protector. If you add rim protector and Mark Sears, really the only hole that you have in this lineup is maybe center depth, because if that rim protector then got hurt, you've got Aiden Sherrill. Then you really don't have another center. I guess you could do the Grant at 5 thing again. But you don't have that extra guy. I think, like, if you could magically, make Mo Diabate 2 inches taller, you'd feel a lot better about that position. But I mean, we're really stretching for holes there. I mean, I think at a very, a dire situation, you still have Grant Nelson as your, either they're your 5 or your, somebody that can slot in behind Aiden Sherrill. So I mean, you're doing pretty fine, and that's the biggest hole I think I could find in that lineup.
Yeah, lot of potential stuff to be excited about. An on paper roster that I think should have, Alabama fans super, super excited to pair with the best coach in the SEC. I don't think you can dispute that at this point, of Oats' career with what he did, getting a team to the Final Four. Tony, any final thoughts before we depart and kick this one off?
I would call first before we go. I mean, like, is it too bullish to say that NATO's top 5 college basketball coach at the moment, especially if you consider the way that the modern game is played and the way his system fits into it? I mean, maybe let's go to another Final Four, but I think him going to the Final Four opens up that discussion, right? I mean, there's a lot of good names there, and I think he's definitely in the mix. I mean, he's definitely top 10, but I think,
Yeah,
with
he
the way the
approaches.
game's being played now, I wouldn't. He might sneak into that top 5 range.
You get in an interesting rabbit hole when you do these conversations right now, because you have these coaches like Tom Izzo and Bill Self who've just done it for so long. But you know, I guess with Izzo in particular, it's like he hasn't done it as much recently. So it's, how much of that do you have a conversation about? But certainly top 10, he's getting paid like a top 5 coach, and he's proven that he can win like one. So yeah, not far fetched at all. And it's exciting times in Tuscaloosa, in Coleman, that should be in Coleman Coliseum here next season. That'll wrap it up for the podcast this week. Hope everyone enjoyed. Everyone go subscribe to Tide Illustrated. Going to have a bunch of football stuff, a bunch of recruiting stuff going forward, and any basketball news that comes to the fore as well. Until then, we'll see you next time.